Well, I'm really delighted to be here, even though our topic can be a tough one. But we all have to deal with it. We all have to address loss in big ways and small ways. We lose loved ones. We lose things that we thought we would hold on to forever. And so today we're going to look at 4 writers who were willing to look in a sustained way at their grief on losing a loved one, which I can't even imagine. Putting so much time into trying to document and process and transform that grief. And so that's kind of our focus today. And we're going to look at 4 writers, contemporary writers. One is lost to us now, and that's Donald Hall. But we're also going to look at the writing of Edward Hirsch, who lost his son, Naomi Shihab Nye, who wrote a lovely tribute to her father, and then Tess Gallagher, who writes beautifully, very private kind of expressions of her feelings for her husband, Raymond Carver, the celebrated short story writer. And I should say that Donald Hall, of course, was writing about his wife, Jane Kenyon, another poet much beloved by their readership. Okay. Donald Hall wrote this book in the 90s. His wife, Jane, died of cancer. She was not the one who was supposed to go. He had terrible illnesses. She watched that. She lived through that with him, but he survived. And then she got sick, and this book chronicles that loss, that illness, and then the death, and then trying to live without Jane. Okay? I've borrowed my title, A World Without, Seeing Grief Through Poet's Eyes, from Hall. The word without here is this idea that we think the world, we feel the world for our loved one, but there comes a time when we must be without them. Okay. Then we have Tess Gallagher writing about Raymond Carver, Moon Crossing Bridge. She wrote this also in the 90s. Moon Crossing Bridge is the name of a bridge in Japan. And I think this graphic actually gives us a hint into something about Tess Gallagher's way of communing with those she's lost. The notion here would be that the horizontal rectangle there is the bridge, and the moon is passing from one side over to the other. And of the 4 poets we're going to look at, if I had to pick a word for her, I would call her a spiritualist. Though she might not subscribe to that word, she's entirely comfortable with this idea that we kind of cross back and forth over that bridge. It's quite fluid for her. Quite interesting. Transfer by Naomi Shihab Nye has other poems in it, but they're mostly about her dad. Her dad was dispossessed from his home in Palestine, in Jerusalem. Arab-American writer. When her father came over to America in college, he made his life here, but he had to leave his homeland. And it always was important to him. He always grieved over the fighting and the challenges to peace. And so she remembers him in these poems for someone who is deeply committed to maintaining his Palestinian identity, and also just what a man of stories and joy he was. And finally, Edward Hirsch's book, Gabriel, written a few years ago, called a poem, not a set of poems. It's a continuous poem, a wrenching poem in lots of ways, about his 22-year-old son who died of cardiac arrest when he took a club drug, GHB. And this young man had a turbulent life, but there was great love between father and son, and he confronts that. Okay? So we've got 4 different poets and perspectives, but what I've come to think about all of them is that they're willing to allow themselves to feel their way through the loss. And I think if we're trying to talk about what can we take away when we think about seeing grief through poets' eyes, they're remarkable exemplars of that ability to kind of say, I accept this. This is horrible, but I will do this. I have something to do here. I have a work to do here. Okay. But then with that, each is individual. Each way of mourning, each way of confronting grief is individual. That's what I've come to learn by spending my time with them. Okay? Some just shun consolation, and some feel that the communication is ongoing. So we're going to start with a poem within the larger poem. This is after his son Gabriel's death. I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path. Because there's no path, there's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into. And time with its medieval chambers, time with its jagged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves, though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with them again. And then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief. I'm not ready for your heaviness. Cement it to my body. Look closely and you'll see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day. Now, I'd like to spend a little bit of time with this poem more than others, because I think there are 3 things that will run through the rest of what we're doing. One is that there's an image here, that of Sisyphus. And we're all familiar with the story of how he was a king, punished in the underworld to have to keep rolling that boulder up to the hill, and just when he got near to the top, it would roll back down and he'd have to start again. Okay? And it's clear from this that that's, for Hirsch, what the work of mourning is like. You know, you just get to the point where you feel like you're maybe getting over it, getting on top of it, like when he sees his son in his sleep, or maybe other moments of consolation, but boom, back down, starting all over again. Okay? The second thing I'd like to point to is that we can imagine someone being so immersed in their anguish that they cannot see anything but their anguish. And so the process by which Hirsch arrived at this, to me, is an achievement in compassion, because he says, look closely and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. Okay? It's saying something to be able to go outside yourself and say, you're suffering too, aren't you? Man, I didn't know it was going to be so hard. So mourning is not just a bad feeling, it's work, god-awful, damn hard work, says Hirsch. But then, I think there's something else interesting going on here, because while we have this major metaphor of Sisyphus, right? That's kind of the overriding metaphor throughout this. You might miss the fact that he's kind of bringing other things in, like the struggle through the ragged underbrush. It's a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, this like passive, inert, just throw me in the river, all right? And then he does things which I'll call like verbal reversals or verbal turnabouts. The mountaintop, there is no mountaintop. Without an upward path, oh, a path. Oh, there's no path, okay? So my question to you, maybe we could talk about at the end, because in the last 10 minutes or so, I want us to have a conversation, okay? Why load in all these images? Why confound things? Is it because that mourning is not only hard, it's also bewildering? But we'll put it out there. Okay? Confounding, complicated, something that is not simple to get our heads around, our hearts around. Now, one of the exercises I'd invite you to is to just think in terms of these root metaphors, okay? The metaphor of weight, carrying a heavy weight, is not unique, right? We've probably said it ourselves. Oh, I feel like Sisyphus, right? Look at this sculpture. Raising Kern by Celeste Roberge, okay? A cairn, I can't quite say it, is a structure of stones, right? A memorial marker, right? But here we have those stones not just out there, but embodied. But it's rising Kern, right? There's some attempt to lift oneself up, okay? Stay with this idea of what metaphor is adequate, perhaps, for something that you know that touches you. Look at this sculpture by Albert Gheorghi. Entirely different image, right? Being emptied out. I saw one commenter on this saying, oh, I get this. It's this feeling of being blasted out. And I said, wow, that's how you saw it, okay? So my first question, and this is not a quiz, this is just a conversation starter, is this one for you. What image might you use to represent grief? Okay, so sit with that, jot down something if you like. We'll catch up within the last 10, 15 minutes, okay? All right. So now, as I've been trying to kind of look across these four books, these four poets' work, one of the things that seems to run through their work, and then I started to realize it runs through many elegists' work, is this idea of the presence of the absent. Okay? And so for Hirsch, his son is present sometimes in those dreams. Okay? But then there's that presence that comes with seeing something, and it triggers a memory, or everything comes flooding back, right? I'm going to go back 100 years, away from these four poets, just to show how perennial this approach is. This is from D.H. Lawrence, and just to quick paraphrase it, it's probably about Lawrence's relationship to his mother, though we got to be careful sometimes to kind of project autobiography into it, but I think we could trust that it's probably him talking about his mom who died again of cancer, and he's smoking a cigarette, and he's kind of, he forgets about it, but he does all of a sudden notice the stream of smoke coming up from the end of the cigarette, and he gets a pang. Something stirs in him, and then he says, oh, when my mom was just starting her illness, I would carry her down the stairs. And then I'd sometimes notice threads, like strands of her hair, her gray hair on my coat. And I would peel them off and I'd take them over to the fireplace. And then the hot currents coming up from the fireplace would take that hair and send it up into the dark chimney. So that's why I was affected that way by the cigarette smoke, okay? So let me just read it. Why does the thin gray strand floating up from the forgotten cigarette between my fingers, why does it trouble me? You will understand. When I carried my mother downstairs a few times only at the beginning of her soft foot malady, could I check in here? Malady, illness. But soft foot here suggests the idea it's an illness that kind of approaches on soft feet, comes quietly. I should find for a reprimand to my gaiety a few long gray hairs on the breast of my coat, and one by one I watch them float up the dark chimney. Let's look at our first poem from Naomi Shihab Nye. Starts with this epigraph by another poet, Jack Riddle. Grief's an ambush. You're walking along, feeling fine. Look down, see a leaf, and begin to weep. Now, her father must have had so much sparkle, so much life. One of the sections of this book is, call me Aziz, because everyone he would meet, he wouldn't know him at all, but he, a custodian or a general, didn't matter. Call me Aziz. Slim specimens, the size of a pickle. Your excitement lit up the aisle. Happy with a salad, cup of mint tea. We lived that way for years. Minor days tucked one into another. But what restlessness underground. Pit of the plum. Nothing worked out in the homeland, came to fruition or changed. Depressed and stay depressed. You wouldn't use a cane, though you'd collected them for years. It'll make me look old. You'll look older if you're dead. Not true. In your last bed, you became a sleek young man, skin unruffled after the last horrible hour. When he finally passed, he gave up the spirit. There was this calmness. We want memories compact as mounds of tiny cucumbers, mottled green, but they're not. They're dim hallways, strange, curvaceous aches, the years we'd do anything to replay. And here's a leaf in the shape of an A, and I can't go on. Okay. So I have a feeling everyone here knows that this was quite a love affair between Jane Kenyon and Donald Hall. And it captured the hearts and imaginations of enough people that Bill Moyers did a special about the two of them when they're both alive and did interviews with them, readings. Okay. And when Jane Kenyon died, she was laid to rest in Proctor's Cemetery. There's an image you can find where his name is not there yet. He only died just last year. You see. This is from a poem of his, Letter with No Address. It's too long to read the whole thing, so I'm just giving sections. Your daffodils rose up and collapsed in their yellow bodies on the hillside garden above the bricks you laid out in sand, squatting with pants pegged and face masked like a beekeeper's against the black flies. Buttercups circled the planks of the old wellhead this May, while your silken gardener's body withers or molds in the Proctor graveyard. I drive and talk to you crying and come back to this house to talk to your photographs. You could feel that pull to keep communicating, right? There's news to tell you, and then it goes on for a bit, doesn't it, with reminiscences and the routine of his life after she's gone. And then it picks up again. Always the weather. Writing its book of the world returns you to me. Ordinary days were the best when we worked over poems in our separate rooms. I remember watching you gaze out the January window into the garden of snow and ice, your face wrapped as you imagine burgundy lilies. Your presence in this house is almost as enormous and painful as your absence. And I hate to say it, I hate to admit it, just because they're present doesn't mean it always feels so good, right? It's not always a consolation. Tess Gallagher. Here the image, the trigger for her is a moth while she's in the bathtub and sees the moth on the wall. In the bath, I look up and see the brown moth pressed like a pair of unpredictable lips against the white wall. I heat up the water, running as much hot in as I can stand. These handfuls over my shoulder, how once he pulled my head against his thigh and dipped a rivulet down my neck of coldest water from the spring we were drinking from. Beautiful mischief that stills a moment, so I can never look back. Only now, brightest now, and the water never hot enough to drive that shiver out. But I remember solitude, no other presence, and each thing what it was. Not this raw fluttering I make of you, as you have made of me your watchfire, your killing light. Used to be, if I looked at a moth, they say there's a moth. Now I look at a moth and they think there's Ray. I make you this fluttering presence. And I'm that flame you're drawn to, that watchfire, that light. So another question for you. How is your lost loved one? This is if you have somebody present to you in a deep, meaningful way. How are they still present to you? There's a final concern we have time for, and that is, what do poets do to transform grief? How far does it allow them to reconcile, to absorb it, to make it part of their becoming? This again from Donald Hall's poem. He's talking to Jane. He's writing a letter to her. You know now whether the soul survives death, or you don't. When you were dying, you said you didn't fear punishment. We never dared to speak of paradise, okay? Right? Maybe a couple centuries ago when Tennyson would write about his good young friend Arthur Hallam, he could count on the fact that he was in heaven and everything was okay. Okay? But that is not an easy confidence for all of us anymore. And so he's sort of agnostic about this. You know, now you know everything, or you don't. Okay? And you were never afraid of punishment. You weren't afraid of hellfires. But we didn't even dare talk about heaven. Now Hirsch, raised in a Jewish family, Jewish traditions, talking back to God. I will not forgive you, son of emptiness, sky of blank clouds. I will not forgive you, indifferent God, until you give me my son back. And the last poem, what I'll close with, and then if we have some time to talk, I'd really like that. Okay. Naomi Shihab Nye's Where Are You Now? And before I read it, notice the titles of those last two poems. Let's go back. Now That I'm Never Alone, okay? Versus Letter with No Address. For Gallagher, you're always there, babe, okay? Right? Letter with no address, I got to keep talking to you. I don't know where you are. I don't know what form you exist in. And so this last one from Shihab Nye. Where are you now? Where are you now? I've heard interviews with her. She just loved her father's folk tales that he would say to her at night when she was very little, 2, 4, 6 years old. I positioned my head on the pillow where you told your last folk tale, mixing donkey, camel, mouse, journey, kitchens, trees. So the story grew jumbled, uncharacteristically long. I listened from the other small bed thinking, not about the story, but it's the last one I'll hear from this voice. Remembering 2 and 4 and 6 when this voice calmed me every night, thinking, how will I live without this voice? At one point you hallucinated. Politics came in, a rare speck of religion, even a bad nurse he had had at the clinic, frustration of long illness tangling with the tale. Oh, Dad, you've been so brave, to which you replied, what else can I do? And returned to the comforting donkey, bucket of olives, smoke curling up from twig fire, over which anyone, a lost girl, a wanderer, a dying man, could warm his hands. And where's the consolation here? It's in those stories. They're from the homeland, but they're folk tales, so they're universal, and he's connected to them, and he lives on in those. So I'll ask my last question and return to the earlier ones, and then I hope we could chat. Does a person ever get over grief? Do we totally move on? Again, how is your lost loved one still present to you? And what image might you use to represent grief? And at that point, I just would love to have us talk a little bit. Not necessarily about these, but if it's a way to start talking, or if there's a thought you had while we've been together, please say something. I mentioned the Without was written in the 90s, and Tess Gallagher's book in the 90s. Tess Gallagher is truly a beautiful illustration of never attempting to replace or kind of put behind all that she has lived through. And so certainly the intensity of that encounter with him lasted a good long time. She herself said, I go on. She's had other love affairs. I think she's been married again. That she goes on, but it's all incorporated in here. There's no sense of like replacing Ray at all. You know, it's all part of the unfolding. Donald Hall continued to write about Jane in poetry, but also in a memoir. You know, and so he was asked, you know, it's like, oh, what you're doing is so brave to do this, and I think it is too. But he said, you know, I'm a writer. This is what I need to do. This is how I process my life. And Edward Hirsch, right after the tragic death of Gabriel, world turned upside down just instantly. A little bit later, he began what he called his dossier, which was simply trying to get all the information he possibly could get from Gabriel's friends and from family and things he could dig up that he had in his house, and just created this incredible dossier. And while he was doing that, he felt a good measure of comfort. And as soon as the dossier was done, plummet, the boulder rolled down again. And then he converted the dossier into this narrative, this fabulous narrative. It's strong. It's really something. I recommend all 4, but maybe because I glimpse a little bit of Gabriel in my son, just a little bit, you know, it's easier for me to identify with what he's talking about, you know, but it's a powerful book. One of the reasons I chose The World Without is not just because it's without your loved one, But there's that old sense of the world where without means out there, the world without, the world out there. And these poets, they're in touch with these things. It's like in your story, Josh, it's Freud who's better in touch with the thing in front of him, right? When he's talking with that poet. Somehow the poet just couldn't even absorb himself. It doesn't sound like a poet to me, you know, but am I right that it was Freud who understood? Yeah. Tess Gallagher, I like a lot. I have to keep reading her because I don't get her all the time. I often don't get her. But she herself said, I kind of leave these openings for you to kind of fill it in. You know, there's enough that you're oriented to in what I'm saying, but the rest you take over, which is nice. It makes me appreciate the more oblique, the more elusive poet. That I said, why do you make it so hard? I make it hard so you can find your way with it. I think there is one more thing I'd like to say, and it's that I love the language of the poetry. I read it as an academic, but I really read it as how is this going to help me live my life better? And the conclusion I came to after reading these and reading other books is, you know, if you're suffering a loss and you turn to poetry, if you read Tess Gallagher and say, boy, that I don't get it, then turn to somebody else. Turn to Jane Kenyon, turn to Donald Hall, turn to Edward Hirsch, because there's somebody out there who has this kind of simpatico way of being in the world, and they're the one you need. Seek them out. Yeah. I think I'll close here, and I just thank you all for coming. It really was a joy. Thanks. Thanks.